Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Keren Yarhi-Milo, the Dean of SIPA and the Adlai Stevenson Professor of International Relations. Today's discussion is about one of the most difficult global challenges of our time, the ongoing war in Ukraine. And as we approach the 2-year anniversary of this conflict, the path to a peaceful resolution remains unclear. The situation in Ukraine is complex and it's dynamic, and especially as the support for the war, as we see from public opinion polls, wanes in the West. Ukraine's counteroffensive recently this past year has stalled and failed to show significant progress on the battlefield, unfortunately. And meanwhile, Russian forces continue to make advances in the east, with President Vladimir Putin steadfast in his commitment, claim large parts of the country. Now that makes 2024 a really pivotal year for this conflict. And will this be the year that the war winds down and a peace agreement is signed, or will the war of attrition continue to grind on with more casualties we see from both sides, and thousands of more soldiers and civilians tragedy losing their lives? So to make this sense of what is happening in the war in Ukraine today and the future and what comes next, we are joined by 4 leading scholars of international politics, and their dialogue will draw out different perspectives on the war and its potential conclusion. And it's really what we're interested in here at SIPA and the Institute of Global Politics, is to take a range of topics around foreign policy and bring different perspectives and find out areas of agreement, disagreement, and give you, hopefully, a lot of food for thought. So first, I'm pleased to welcome Michael Dash. He's the Paki J.D. Professor of International Relations at the University of Notre Dame, and Brian and Janelle Brady Family Director of the Notre Dame International Security Center. Really pleased to have you with us, Mike. Thank you. I'm also thrilled to have Charlie Kupchan here. He is a professor of international affairs at Georgetown University and the Walsh School of Foreign Service and the Department of Georgetown, and a senior fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. Charlie is really an expert in the field of international security, is also extensive experience in the government. And finally, we're joined by Columbia's own Jeffrey Sachs, who needs no introduction. He's the director of the Center of Sustainable Development. And I think between the 3 panelists here, you could fill a whole bookshelf of books, really interesting books on this topic and beyond. And our moderator for today is Peter Clement. And Peter is really such an asset to the SIPA faculty and to me as someone who writes about intelligence, political psychology of decision-making, foreign policy and intelligence relations. Peter was the interim successor my interim successor as the director of the Arnold Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies. And he's also currently a visiting senior research scholar at the Saltzman Institute. The Saltzman Institute, as many of you know, is truly one of the jewels at SIPA's crown, and it is because of scholars and practitioners like Peter that we've seen since the beginning of the war a real constant analysis coming from the group of scholars at the Saltzman Institute, and Peter in particular has been such a valuable member helping us lead the conversation on this topic. So today's discussion is the first in a series of events that IGP will be holding devoted to Ukraine and its future this year, with a specific focus on Ukraine's recovery and the next steps. Please stay tuned for more information on that front. And thank you again to our panelists and our moderator. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Karen. And let me say, it's a pleasure to be here today. I'm delighted to be the moderator with a panel of such distinguished scholars, some of whom I know and some I'm just meeting for the first time. So thank you all for taking the time to be here. We will cover probably 40, 45 minutes, and I hope to save enough time in the last 10 minutes or so, maybe 15, to get to some of the nice questions that were generated by the students, which have been submitted online already. There's a huge debate that continues to this day about the origins of this war, this terrible war in Ukraine. But today we're really going to focus on what I would call the situation facing most policymakers, be it Washington or Moscow or Kiev, on, okay, where do we go from here? How do we see this war moving along? What are the prospects for a ceasefire? And what are the things that policymakers in these various countries can do to hopefully accelerate the process that leads to some kind of a denouement or conclusion to this war? So with that in mind, if I could ask our three panelists to give me an answer to question number one, what factors do you believe are most critical in assessing the thinking in Kiev and Moscow about possible ceasefire proposal, their receptivity to such proposal? So let me start with Professor Dash.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Receptivity to a ceasefire proposal. That's a bit of a freighted question, I think. I think in principle, President Putin says that he's interested and receptive to ceasefire proposals. Now, what exactly would be an acceptable ceasefire proposal to him, of course, remains to be seen. The real question for me is whether Putin has a partner in Kiev. And this is a very interesting question because Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was in previous periods receptive to a negotiated settlement to this whole mess. He was elected in 2019 in part on a platform of ending the war in Donbass, which most people interpreted as re-engaging with the by then moribund Minsk process. And then early in the war, in late February and March of 2022, the Russians and the Ukrainians were engaged in very serious peace talks, not only under the track through Turkey and President Erdogan, but Israeli Prime Minister, then Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett was also working that account. I think since then, President Zelensky has become far less willing to engage in a negotiated settlement. And the reasons for that, we can discuss at length. Is it domestic opposition? Is it opposition from Boris Johnson and Joe Biden, et cetera, et cetera? But I think just to put a sharp point on it and be a little bit provocative, I think the problem of receptivity is greater in Kiev at this point than it is in Moscow.
Thank you, Professor Dash. Charlie or Jeff, who would like to go next?
I'm happy to jump in and then pass it to Jeff. I guess I see it a little bit differently than Mike in the sense that I don't think that either from Kiev's perspective or Moscow's perspective, there is sufficient overlap in what constitutes the terms of a ceasefire that we would expect one anytime soon. That is that Kiev's minimum demands and Moscow's minimum demands, I don't think, meet in the middle. And as a consequence, I would be very surprised if we get some kind of consensual end game at least over the course of 2024. That having been said, I do think that de facto, we are headed toward what I would call a stalemate and a lower intensity conflict by default, not by design. And that's simply because Ukraine's offensive hasn't gone particularly well. And we now see Ukraine pivoting, it seems, and I support this move, to a defensive posture rather than an offensive posture, to trying to hold the line and to protect and rebuild the 82% of Ukraine that is still under Kyiv's control. And I think that's a very important move, number one, because the aid that the West is able to provide seems to be on a downward trajectory. And as a consequence, the level of training, of armor, of munitions that the Ukrainians would need to prosecute further offensive is likely to be hard to come by. And even if it is sent, I'm skeptical that Ukraine can muster the military capability to break through what are lines, miles of tank traps, minefields, fortifications, more defensive blockages. They really ran into a buzzsaw over the course of the offensive. And I do think that we need to understand that Russia has already been dealt a strategic defeat. Putin wanted to take over Ukraine, and he was rebuffed. Ukraine has been lost by Putin. It is now united around an anti-Russian identity. And as a consequence, I would focus on ensuring that the Ukraine that exists today is able to defend itself for the long haul and rebuilds itself economically and politically. So I do think that we're headed toward what I would call a stalemate, perhaps a new frozen conflict. And then down the road, maybe we'll see a ceasefire and a set of follow-on negotiations. But that's where I see things headed over the course of 2024.
Thanks so much, Charlie. Jeff?
Oh, good. It's interesting because I strongly disagree with Charlie. So that's
I'm shocked.
Yeah, so that's good. This war could have been avoided entirely, and it could have been ended in March 2022 because it's all based on the U.S. Trying to push NATO to Ukraine, also to Georgia, another debacle, all part of a concept that goes back nearly 30 years. And this has been acknowledged by everybody now, by Ukraine's negotiators. I had extensive discussions with the Turkish mediators. Basically, this is a war over NATO enlargement. And it was a terrible idea to try to push NATO over Russia's absolutely understandable opposition to Ukraine. And it has been a disaster for Ukraine. Russia was not trying to take over Ukraine. Russia was trying to push Ukraine to neutrality, which was accepted in March 2022, actually up to the point of an agreed document. And as everybody has explained, and I've heard privately as well as all the public explanations, the US came in and told them, no way, you are going to fight on, we're going to back you, you're going to get HIMARS, you're going to get our weapon systems, you're going to fight on, you're going to defeat that bastard Putin. Because that's the US idea. Putin wasn't trying to take over Ukraine with some small actual initial operation in February 2022. The numbers were tiny. The idea was to push Zelensky to the negotiating table, which happened in about 3 days, actually. and the negotiations began, and they would have come to fruition, and the war would have ended. The war would have ended, never taken place in December 2021, when Putin put on the table a draft agreement with the US to stop NATO enlargement. And I spoke to the White House then. I said, take the damn offer and avoid this war, because it makes no sense to push NATO to Ukraine. And I was told, no, it's our policy. It's an open door. Anyone can join. What crazy nonsense that is. But that remains our policy till today. So we keep telling Ukrainians, go die, go to the battlefield. As usual, our generals get it just right. They told us Ukraine's going to slice through the Russian defenses and reach the Sea of Azov a few months ago. Of course, it was a bloody disaster, totally predictably. But to this day, Biden won't pick up the phone, call Putin, and say, you know, that NATO enlargement was really a bad idea. That's what it would take to end this war. And that is what should have happened from the beginning. In 2007, in Munich, Putin was right. He said, don't do what you're going to do. Stop. You told us in 1990, no NATO enlargement, not 1 inch eastward. Now we've had waves of enlargement. Do not go to Ukraine. Of course, George W. the next year in Bucharest said, we're going to Ukraine, we're going to Georgia. And this was part of a plan laid out by Brzezinski in 1997. You can read all about it, to the date, to the year. And we could not accept that wasn't a good idea, even though our top diplomats, Bill Burns and George Kennan and Bill Perry, said this is absurd. But the politicians kept pushing, and we're today still trapped in this terrible idea that it's crucial. And even just days ago, they reiterated Ukraine will be a member of NATO. Well, Russia's not going to allow it. So either it's perpetual war or Russia wins. And I don't think one can say it's a stalemate necessarily. Russia is bloodying Ukraine all along the entire contact line right now. And they've got a lot more reserves, a lot more weapons, a lot more artillery, a lot more missiles, and a lot more reserves than Ukraine. So I don't think it's right to declare this as a stalemate. I think it could be an absolutely ungodly mess that we have pushed Ukraine into. So that's where I would stop. Pick up the phone, stop the NATO enlargement, and make peace.
So I'd like to go to the next question, but I have to first ask if either Charlie or Michael have any thoughts in response to Jeff's assessment here. Charlie, I suspect you might have.
I agree with so much of what Jeff said that, you know, I'm tempted to just say ditto. The one thing I would say, I mean, there's no doubt that the United States, the Biden administration, and the West in generally, especially Boris Johnson, have a lot of responsibility for derailing opportunities to avoid this mess. But, you know, sort of going forward, I'd like to focus on the question about the agency of the current president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, and whether he's the right guy going forward. I think that had he been willing to stay the course that he was elected on and that he pursued early in March of 2022, what the United States and what the United Kingdom and the rest of NATO were pushing him to do, he might have been able to say, fine, thank you, but we're going in another direction. The fact that he didn't do that, and in fact, he seems even more intransigent now, leads me to have really serious doubts that he can find the road ahead for Ukraine.
Charlie,
Yeah,
any
just
thoughts?
a quick response. I don't think you're going to find anybody on this panel, I don't know about you, Peter, who's a big fan of NATO enlargement. And in the spirit of full disclosure, I worked in the White House in the 1990s, fought tooth and nail to prevent the whole enlargement thing from starting, and I lost that battle. And I opposed the statement in 2008 to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. And I agree with Jeff that it really was a strategic error. But I see Russia's intentions very differently. I think part of Putin's grievance was NATO enlargement, but I would point out that the offer that Putin put on the table late in 2020 was not just about neutrality for Ukraine. It was about rolling back the post-Cold War order, pulling out NATO materiel from the eastern flank. I firmly believe that Putin wanted to subjugate Ukraine. In fact, he was on the doorstep of Kyiv. He wanted to kill or topple Zelensky. He keeps talking about the demilitarization or denazification of Ukraine. He says Ukraine doesn't deserve to exist as an independent state. So I think the Russians have quite expansive aims here that, yes, they have a sense of grievance, legitimate grievance over NATO enlargement, but it's much bigger than that. And that's why I think it's important to give Biden credit for marshaling a very significant response that prevented Putin from taking over Ukraine. But now I think we need to focus on consolidating the gains, keeping the Ukraine that is under the control of Kyiv safe, rebuilding it, and trying to get this war to die down and to end and to begin long-term negotiations. But I would be very reluctant to not focus on the nature of Russian aggression. This is a bald act of aggression to pull Ukraine back into Russia's sphere of influence.
Thanks, Charlie. If you all would indulge me, I have to at least say one thing as a longtime Russia watcher. I'm assuming that all of you have actually read the 20-page treatise that Putin issued on July 12th, 2021, called The Historic Unity of Russia and the Ukrainians. To me, that was more than just a comment about NATO enlargement. This was a man with a huge vision of his role in Russian history, which incidentally, that treatise is about a historian giving a tutorial on the 1,000-year history of Russia and Ukraine. In my view, not the most normal thing you would expect of a head of state at this particular moment in time. After reading that, my own personal view was the invasion was inevitable. This was laying down the groundwork. The December 2021 proposal that Charlie just alluded to was a complete non-starter. If it was really focused on the nitty-gritty of Ukraine and NATO, you might have had a basis for discussion, but it was basically a set of demands to withdraw from all of NATO infrastructure among the newly formed members of NATO from Eastern Europe. It was a remarkable statement of basically a set of demands. I also think at that point in time, the decision was made that this invasion was happening. If you look at the military buildup throughout the entirety of 2021, we had debates at Columbia about, is this just a coercive diplomacy? You build up a force of 120 to 160,000 troops on a border to get them to succumb to diplomatic pressure? Or was it part of a bigger plan to invade? My suspicion was the latter, in part because we know now about the documents and the intelligence that Putin had been receiving about this was going to be a cakewalk. Perhaps Putin actually believed he could do this in a week or two. That turned out not to be the case. So anyway, I just felt I needed to offer a Russian watcher's perspective on this. There's plenty of blame to go around. Lots of people, I think Charlie's correct in saying NATO enlargement was a neuralgic point since the 90s, even with Yeltsin. No question about that. The question for me is, does it warrant any leader launching a full-scale war to the degree that we see now? We are literally bombing and targeting civilian targets, massive destruction in a country that Ukraine ostensibly is part of you. So I will stop there.
Yeah, let me
Yeah.
just say that what I find absolutely unbelievable about U.S. foreign policy in general is we don't even try to talk to the other side, and this, to my mind, is why Biden is miserable in foreign policy. Everything is watching, like you say, Russia watching. What do they want? What's he really want? Not to negotiate. You know, when that document was put on the table in December 2021, lots of things are objectionable about it, and many things are completely right about it. And that's what negotiations are about. We didn't even engage in negotiations. We just know this is what he really wants. This is what he doesn't want. And the fact of the matter is that all along, I've been there now for 35 years watching this close up. The United States never talks to Russia. All we do is we dictate because they, they're subservient. So I saw that going back to Gorbachev. I saw that with the way that Yeltsin was treated. I was advisor to Kuchma, by the way, in Ukraine, so I've seen it on the Ukrainian side also. Clinton went ahead with the NATO enlargement, completely contrary. And I thank Charlie for all his efforts. It was unbelievable to start this. But the fact of the matter is, Russia swallowed it when it was the first wave of Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic. Russia even swallowed it the second wave when it was Bulgaria, Romania, the Baltic states, and Slovakia and Slovenia. But my God, to go to the third stage of Ukraine and Georgia and play out this dream of Brzezinski, completely spelled out, by the way, so vividly spelled out. This is the end of Russian power when we surround them in the Black Sea. And to actually do this over Putin's objections. And then, I don't know about you guys, but my view is we overthrew Yanukovych, plain and simple. That this was a typical CIA operation, a typical coup. I saw a piece of it close up. That's what I saw. And I saw ugly stuff, by the way. I'm not going to repeat some of it, but I saw ugly stuff close up about the US involvement in the overthrow of Yanukovych. And that's a big deal because when you're trying to push NATO and then you overthrow the president that wants neutrality, that's pretty damn provocative. And then Russia wasn't pushing for more than Minsk II, and we blew off Minsk II. Autonomy wasn't, I remember our writings. Oh no, we need a unitary state. You can't have you can't have federalism or autonomy in Ukraine. Who says? But that was our view even after the UN Security Council backed Minsk II. So to my mind, there's a lot of provocation from the US side. And just to say what's in Putin's mind on this doesn't make it for me when I've not seen any serious diplomacy from the United States side in 15 years. And they didn't even try to engage in 2021, at the end of 2021. I begged the White House, talk to them. By the way, another point I would make, the US walked away from ABM and has already, of course, put the Aegis missiles both into Poland and Romania, and that's a real security concern for Russia, and we haven't deigned to have a discussion about it. So,
let me proceed to let me go to question number 2. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine.
And some of you have addressed this a little bit already, but let me ask it more explicitly. If you were at the NSC right now and you were the National Security Advisor and you were advising President Biden on how can we get ourselves to the point where we either get a ceasefire, a cessation of hostilities, let alone a negotiated settlement, but at least to a ceasefire, what advice would you give President Biden right now? And let me start with Michael.
Thank you. I mean, that's a no-win situation. I mean, Charlie got steamrolled in the 90s on NATO expansion, and there's a lot of Kool-Aid that we drink that really sort of intoxicates us. And it was, we're still drinking the same Kool-Aid. We have this vision, for example, that there's one Ukrainian nationalism that is just waiting to assume control of the whole historic territory, ignoring the fact that there are in fact multiple Ukrainian nationalisms. We have a view of Putin in particular and authoritarian regimes in general, which leads us to, be completely confident that we know what they want, which is invariably the worst thing, and that there's no dealing with them until they become good liberal democracies like those of us in the West. I think nonetheless, given where we're at, I wouldn't try to make a historical or a conceptual argument. I would just simply say that public opinion has soured on Ukraine. And while people still in general wish them well, the idea of continuing to dump large amounts of money to no seeming end, I think, is not a winning strategy. And indeed, other policy objectives that people care about, like aid to Israel, or like doing more on the southern border in dealing with the immigration crisis. The oxygen is being sucked out of the air by too many things. The Biden administration, I don't know if this is the president himself or his advisors, thinks that they can do all these things. And I just don't think we're in a position at this point. So I think as a practical matter, you've got to decide what's most important to the country and what can you do? And I don't think continuing the level of aid to Ukraine that we've had up until a few months ago is any longer in the cards politically. So I guess what I do is, I go to David Axelrod rather than to Jake Sullivan. This got to be a political argument because the Biden strategists, and I use strategists advisedly, are not reachable, I fear.
Thank you. Charlie?
I guess a three-step policy program. The first would entail making a deal with Republicans on the southern border, partly because it's in the interest of the Biden administration to do so, because I think the administration is vulnerable on immigration, and it would be in a better position in the 2024 election if it strikes a pretty tough deal on border security. And I think Trump seems to be saying don't do it precisely because he knows that he's better off running against an administration that hasn't struck that deal. Then I would use that deal to get a significant amount of money, whether it's 60 billion or half that or 2/3 of it, we'll see, to send the necessary economic and military assistance to Ukraine to keep it a going concern. And I worry about that. I worry that they're going to run out of air defense interceptors, that they're going to run out of money to pay their civil servants. And I do believe that it's in the interest of the United States to keep Ukraine afloat. But as I said, I would really sit down and have a heart-to-heart talk with Zelensky that says, we're going to really focus on defending what you have and rebuilding what you have. And we'll deal with the question of territorial settlements down the road. And then the third piece of it would be pay more attention to the interlinkages between the war in Ukraine and domestic politics. This would in some ways be my biggest criticism of the Biden administration. I think that they thought that after Putin invaded Ukraine, the West was back. The bipartisan internationalism had been restored. and that they could go back onto cruise control like we were during the Cold War. And all the while, I think the America First narrative has gained traction in a way that's come back to haunt the administration. So I think we need to pay much more attention to the interlinkages between the war and a liberal populism on both sides of the Atlantic. I'm deeply worried about what's happening in German politics and in politics elsewhere in Europe. And then the other piece of that would be simply more honesty in our strategic dialogue. You know, you hear every other day, if Putin keeps hold of any chunk of Ukraine, the sky will fall. It's the end of the rules-based order. If he holds on to Bakhmut, then tomorrow night he's going to attack Poland, right? This is all hyperventilation and threat inflation. And I think we need to have a much more sober domestic debate and debate with our allies and the Ukrainians about the stakes and be much more realistic and hard-headed about where this conflict is and how we can wrestle it to the ground.
Thanks, Charlie. Jeff, a quick closing comment before I move on to the next set of questions.
Sure. Well, I like the idea of honesty in our discussion. I think almost everything that's said every day from the White House has been a lie, including that Ukraine was trouncing Russia up until recently. Now, of course, it's the opposite side. And anyone watching this closely should have known better. Well, it's a good question. I tried exactly your hypothetical. I talked to Jake Sullivan. I begged him to avoid this war. I told him it would be a debacle. I told him that it would be politically disastrous. I told him that you're not going to beat Russia in this. I told him so. Now he doesn't want to take my calls anymore because I was very accurate of what was going to happen when we spoke at the end of 2021. This has been a first-class debacle. I don't know, by the way, whether Zelensky has any independent agency at all at this point. Many people that I know say he'd be killed if he tried something else internally. It's a very radical, unpleasant regime right now. There's nothing likable about it. Of course, they're in desperate shape. They grab people off the streets and basically have sent hundreds of thousands of people to grave injuries or to their death. This thing has to stop. So what I would say today is what I said to Sullivan in December 2021, make the call, stop the NATO thing, negotiate a peace in the way that Charlie is saying, but add in that this whole point of the U.S. Position has been so deeply provocative and has backfired. And you know, when we talk about Germany and all the rest, we also shouldn't have blown up the Nord Stream pipeline. All of this has been a terrible debacle for Europe. There isn't a popular politician in Europe on the side of this war. So the war really needs to end so that we can address our own issues. I think we all agree on that.
Peter, could I make just a real quick point?
Sure, go ahead.
You have a little daylight on between Jeff and I, but I have a different take on Zelensky. I think he's quite a courageous guy. I don't think the problem is that he's a coward. I mean, he stood tough. I would have been on the first train or plane out of Kiev on February 22nd I could find. The problem has been more a failure of what Clausewitz called moral courage, the ability to look realism in the eye and make hard decisions. And I think he was, tempted to do that early on. And I think he could do it again if he were to convince himself that that was the right thing for Ukraine. But I think he's, become so far enamored with the Winston Churchill analogies that he's beyond that, but he wasn't always beyond it. So I give him some agency, which is why I regard him as a tragic figure, not a doofer or a scoundrel.
Thank you, Michael. Just for our students, all three of our illustrious speakers here have written in great detail the arguments that they just made here. So if you're looking, Professor Desch has an article in the December issue of Harper's called The Tragedy of Vladimir Zelensky. You've just summed it up perfectly, Professor. Thank you. Jeff, you've written on your own website, the war in Ukraine was provoked and why that matters to achieve peace. Charlie, you had a piece in Foreign Affairs you co-authored with Richard Haas called Redefining Success, a New Strategy Must Balance Means and Ends. So students, if you get to your computer sometime, I can strongly recommend all the articles. They're very well done, nicely written. They're not all coming from the same perspective, but they're definitely worth a read. So if it's okay, we have about 13 minutes. I'd like to go to some of the students' Q&A. I got 6 questions. I will not get to all 6, but let me start. Here's one that looks a little bit down the road. What is the U.S. exit strategy in terms of financial aid? If Biden is reelected, how long-term is the U.S. investment in Ukraine going to be when factoring in the necessary funds for recovery? And what happens if Trump is reelected? Big questions. Any volunteers want to take this first?
I mean, I would say that the U.S., assuming Biden wins, and you still have a British and a German and a French government that is somewhat similar in its disposition as the ones today, there will be a long-term plan to support Ukraine and to give it the necessary military and economic support to keep it afloat. I doubt that Ukraine is going to get into NATO simply because there isn't a consensus. And as a consequence, what's emerging is these series of bilateral agreements. The British have been the first out of the box that essentially kind of give Ukraine a 10-year time horizon to get from here to there. And I think that's likely to play out. And I think it's likely to carry the day, barring some dramatic change on the battlefield, which I don't see. I don't think that either the Russians or the Ukrainians will generate sufficient combat capability to achieve something that looks like victory. If Trump is elected, I guess we take him at face value. He's going to call Putin, and he's going to try to cut some kind of deal which would end the war, and I'm guessing dramatically dial back U.S. assistance to Ukraine. And that's certainly something that the Ukrainians are watching very carefully. In fact, I would say that everywhere I go these days, the one thing on everybody's mind: can Trump win?
Thanks, Charlie.
Charlie, would it be the end of the world in terms of the future of Ukraine if Trump won and did exactly what you said? Because it seems to me the problem with NATO since its inception, and the problem with international aid to Ukraine has been there's been a real moral hazard problem with the United States being such a important part of provision of both economic and military aid. Couldn't one tell the story that if the United States dials back, finally the Europeans will have a serious discussion about what their interest is in a future Ukraine and pick up an even larger part of the responsibility for both political aid and reconstruction and also future military aid?
I mean, I hear you, and I share some of Jeff's views about American foreign policy. We have a seemingly unshakable commitment to overdoing it, and we spent 20 years trying to turn Afghanistan and Iraq into Ohio. That didn't go so well. And then we've pushed the NATO enlargement thing. But I have a very different view of Russia. And I think Jeff gives Russia a free pass. It was Putin, not Obama, who walked away from the reset. It's Putin who has gone into Georgia and Moldova and Kazakhstan and Libya and Syria and Africa. He's a congenital troublemaker, and he's going to keep it up. And as a consequence, I think we need to continue to support Ukraine. If our aid goes down, will the Europeans step up? Probably, and I think they're already doing so. But I do worry, and you know, if Trump were elected, yeah, maybe he would cut a deal with the Russians. Maybe he would be able to negotiate a ceasefire. But I also think that the message sent globally is that the United States doesn't know its own mind, that it's an unreliable partner, and his mere election, regardless of what he does in foreign policy, would, I think, do a lot of damage to America's relationships around the world.
Jeff?
Yeah, of course we're unreliable because we never know what we're doing. This is actually right, but you know, we agree on a lot. But I think the characterization, Charlie, did Putin go into Syria before we did? No. Biden gave, Obama gave the order to overthrow Assad, and Putin came 3 years later. Did Putin go into Libya before we did? No. NATO, because of complete craziness of Sarkozy and all the rest of the gang, took out Gaddafi. We created these messes over and over again. So we should sit down with Putin and actually really negotiate some serious things, not just making the claim, look at all of the terrible things. We're the regime change specialists. We can't keep our hands off of regime change anywhere. And if we had a little bit of self-constraint and self-awareness, we'd actually be able to negotiate with our counterparts, let's put it this way, to keep some peace and some space and some distance between us. So my view is we have wasted many trillions of dollars on absolutely horrendous things. Our country is in a pretty deep social crisis internally. We have, I don't know whether it's 750 or 800 overseas military bases. You would know better than I do, but we're spending more than we can afford by far. We should understand that we're really good at debacles and get out of this one and actually talk to the counterparts, because they actually would like some quiet time too. They need it, and it's not just us versus them. I don't think we disagree so much on that. I just think the way we tend to underestimate our own stirring of the pot in so many places, and then react when the others react to us as aggression. But certainly Syria was caused by the US, one of the most lame-brain policies I can imagine. They just decided to overthrow Assad in 2011, and that was a really bad idea.
Wow. There's one more question from the students. I think we have time. And this actually will be a test of your views on Mr. Putin. The question is, what is next on Putin's agenda once there is a conclusion to the war in Ukraine? I suspect there may be different views here, but Charlie, you want to start this one?
That's a tough one. I mean, I think that as long as Putin is in power, the Russian foreign policy will be more of same, and the United States and its allies need to go back to a policy of containment. We've got 2 new allies, Finland already in, Sweden probably soon to get in once it gets the nod from Hungary. I'm guessing the US troops that went to the eastern flank since Russia's invasion are going to be there for quite some time. I see what Russia has done in Ukraine and what it is doing in Ukraine, right? It is continuing to bomb civilian population centers as a sign of its appetite to be a real troublemaker in the world. And in some ways, I think the bigger question is, what is Xi Jinping going to do? I think we know where Putin's going to be. We don't know where the Chinese are going to be. Are they going to continue to throw their lot in with the Russians? Is there a play here to put some distance between Moscow and Beijing? Who knows? I'm not expecting a Russian attack against NATO. Putin's having a hard enough time fighting Ukraine alone. I don't think he wants to fight Ukraine plus 32 NATO members. Mm-hmm. But he's a troublemaker. And my final comment would be, I remain hopeful that one day Ukraine may again enjoy territorial integrity. But if it does, it's going to be through the negotiating table after Putin is out of office.
So, Charlie, the $64 trillion question is Putin Bismarck, or is he Kaiser Wilhelm II? I listen to you and I hear you sort of saying elements of both of those things. I mean, I think that ultimately Putin is Bismarck, and he has a limited set of things that are his objectives. And there are objectives, by the way, that are not so different than what other great powers have done throughout history. And it's our inability to think about that, as an alternative to, that he's going to push as far as he absolutely can, that has put us in the position that we're in now. I mean, if we would sit down and say, are his demands, for example, about Ukrainian neutrality unrealistic? Are they any different, for example, than what we've demanded since the Monroe Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere? The basis for accommodation becomes clearer. The great irony is realpolitik is the road to solving this in a stable but also a humane way. And it's been the ideologicalization of Putin that has put us in a position where we see the worst in him and we see no basis for accommodation.
To quickly answer your question, I would have said before 2022 that he had strong streaks of Bismarck in him. He was a tough customer, but he also knew when to pull back. He took risks, but he also knew limits. After 2022, I see him as more post-1890 Germany, not knowing limits, becoming ideological. I understand why he objected to NATO membership in Ukraine, but as Peter said, that does not justify efforts to occupy the country. He's killed, I don't know how many thousands of Ukrainians and Russian soldiers, all in the name of some ideological campaign to pull Ukraine back into Russia. And it's failed. It's blown up in his face. So I think the Putin that we have now is a very different Putin than the one that we had earlier in his tenure.
So we're in our last minute. Jeff, you have a closing quick thought?
Yeah, I think we're moving to a post-American hegemonic world, and Putin and President Xi and many other leaders, especially those in the BRICS, that's what they're after. They don't want to be bossed around. They don't want American regime change operations on their soil. They don't want to be taken out. They don't want their allies taken out by American covert operations or overt operations. I think if we had a more mature foreign policy that was more respectful of truth, honesty, and making peace and not pushing limits, we would find the same on the other side. But when we have a president to this day who says we're the country that all the world looks to for leadership, we're in a very confused state, and that's why we're in wars all over the place and threatening even more war now in East Asia, on top of an expanding war in the Middle East. We need to calm down and stop the provocations that have led us to all of these conflicts, and it's possible to do.
Well, thank you all very much. We're really well-informed, very collegial discussion, debate, exchange of views. It's exactly what I enjoy the most about being in the world of academia. So thank you all again. I look forward, hopefully, to seeing you again in person. I think that would have been a lot more fun. We could debate even more afterwards, but thank you all very much and have a great day.
Thanks.
Peter.
Thanks so
Nice to
much,
see you,
everybody.
Thanks, Charlie. Thanks, Jeff.